Hello to everyone watching and listening. Today I'm speaking once again, because we've done it before, with playwright, journalist, and political satirist Andrew Doyle, also known as Titania McGrath. We discuss the intentional irrationality of the far left doctrines that use religious rhetoric and practices despite the absence of God, or perhaps the presence of a different God, their paramount desire to dismantle societal structures, regardless of need or merit, the argument for transcendence inherent in the pursuit of art, and how woke culture stifles genuine expression, forcing dogma to take the place of fundamental truths, and, say, purposefully doing so. Looking forward to it. Well, Mr. Doyle, it's good to see you again. I think we're damn near friends, or at least I like you. I don't know what you think about me, but...
The feeling's very much mutual, Jordan. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, that's good. Well, us reprehensible types, we need to stick together.
We do.
Yeah, that's for sure. So I thought I'd hassle you for a bit first. I got two things to hassle you about, I think. The first is, it says on your Wikipedia page, for whatever that's worth, that you regard yourself as left-wing, and so I think you deserve some harassment for that, but also I don't know what the hell that means anymore. And then after I'm done bugging you about that, I thought I'd bother you about having a PhD in early Renaissance poetry, and
okay,
make the humiliation complete. Okay, let's start with the left-wing thing.
Okay, yes. Well, firstly, I'd say that Wikipedia is full of errors. I wouldn't trust absolutely everything you see on Wikipedia. However, on that score, I think it's broadly accurate. I know that, I've never voted for a right-wing party. I did vote for Jeremy Corbyn, which, to be honest, I now regret.
As you should.
I think if you I'm with you. I don't really know what left-wing and right-wing means anymore. I think the culture war has in fact obliterated those two designations. I really do believe that because, if you were to write down my views on most subjects and sort of give them to an impartial observer and say, is this person on the left or on the right? I think broadly speaking, most of my values would fall into what traditionally would be considered left-wing. I think I have some sort of more conservative values when it comes to culture and education and the arts, perhaps. But that's the same as someone like George Orwell, who was very much a cultural conservative as well as being a socialist. I think economically speaking, I do believe in fair proportionate taxation of the wealthy. I do believe in the welfare state. All of those I believe in redressing economic inequality, looking out for working class people, social mobility. So all of these kind of things I think would traditionally be deemed to be left-wing. But I think what the culture war has effectively done is it's substituted group identity for the notion of class and money. And what that now means is that people who describe themselves as left-wing are nothing of the kind. Most of the activists that you see, the sort of most vociferous cheerleaders of the critical social justice movement tend to be, let's put it nicely, quite posh. They tend to have quite plummy voices, double-barreled names. They're called things like Hugo Ponsford and Sage Willoughby and things like this. Particularly the case with environmental activists. Those people who glue themselves to Van Gogh paintings and the Statue of David or whatever it might be. When they talk, they are almost like a caricature, like the kind of thing that I would have invented as a joke of a kind of
and have
activist.
Invented, in fact.
Exactly. Well, Titania McGrath has that name because she's very, very well off. Part of the joke with that and part of what I find so funny about so many of these activists is that they are bleating about oppression and persecution and privilege, and they're independently wealthy. They've had everything handed to them on a plate. They're not in a position to do that.
But Andrew, you look. I noticed this when I was teaching at Harvard, at an Ivy League school, obviously, and so all of my students were the top 1%, obviously, and if they weren't at that moment, they were going to be by the time they were 40. So at worst, they were top 1% in what would you call infancy? There we go. And so you might think that'd be good enough on the privilege side, but it seems to me that there's a small coterie of very noisy people for whom being rich and privileged is not enough. They also want all the victimization privileges of being oppressed, because then you can have bloody well everything, can't you? And if you're a narcissistic psychopath, then everything is what you want, and you want it now. And I want to just follow up on that a bit with regards to this left-wing issue, eh? So, there's about a dozen studies now. I want to write an article about this, or maybe even a book. There's about a dozen studies now looking at the personality predictors of left-wing authoritarianism. And so, from the end of World War II till 2016, social psychologists in particular, and that's a rather dismal discipline, denied the existence of left-wing authoritarianism outright. It was only a right-wing phenomenon, apparently. Stalin and Mao notwithstanding. But it started to switch a bit in 2016. We did a study in my lab, first of all, showing that left-wing authoritarianism was you could identify a coherent set of beliefs statistically that were associated with so-called progressive causes allied with the willingness to impose them using fear, force, and compulsion. So that's not a bad definition of left-wing authoritarianism. But then a number of other studies have come out, and the most interesting ones concentrate on what's known as the dark tetrad. And the dark tetrad is a group of personality traits that were too evil to make it into the standard personality models. They were excluded by fiat to begin with. Manipulativeness, that's Machiavellianism. Psychopathy, which is predatory parasitism. Narcissism, that was the original dark triad. But that wasn't bad enough, so the psychologists had to add sadism to it to fill in the last quadrant. And the correlation between dark tetrad personality traits and left-wing authoritarianism is so high that it isn't obvious that they're distinguishable. And so what I see happening... Go ahead.
Is it not similarly high amongst right-wing authoritarians?
No, it's not.
So it's a different kind of authoritarianism.
Yes, this isn't clearly laid out yet, but the focus at the moment... Now, I think, first of all, anybody who's willing to use fear and compulsion and force is likely to also be characterized by those dark tetrad traits. But I think the additional pathology that emerges on the left, and this is something we can discuss, obviously, is that you have to be a particular kind of evil snake to mask your psychopathic power-mongering in the guise of compassion. And I don't think the right-wing authoritarians do that. They more or less come right out and say, fuck you, I'm going to take everything you have, especially if you're a group I don't like. But the left-wing types, they say, well, really, I'm your best friend.
Historically speaking, is that necessarily the case? If you take the example of the Third Reich and Nazism, that was underpinned by a belief, a sincere belief, a sort of quasi-religious belief that what they were doing was for the good of society. However abhorrent we might find it.
Look, fair enough, man. I know perfectly well that in the 1930s, for example, as the Nazis marched towards the death camps, their primary rationale for the original implementation of euthanasia, so to speak, of mass killing, was compassionate euthanasia. But then I would also say, and this is something we actually don't know, that the Nazis were National Socialists, and their political stance was a weird mixture of what we would think of as left and right wing now, right? There was the fascist component that involved the aggregation of power at the pinnacle, corporate and governmental and media, all of that, right? So that seems kind of right wing and monolithic, but it wasn't like there were socialist elements in the platform as well. And so we don't know enough to sort that out, I would say, maybe on the statistical side.
But doesn't all of this sort of point to the fact, or not even the fact, but my contention, that actually thinking in terms of left and right when it comes to this is kind of redundant? I think in a way you've sort of hit it.
Yeah, exactly.
The debate has always been the struggle between liberty and authority. And so, to go back to whether I'm left-wing or right-wing, I think I'm probably just liberal. I think there are liberal-minded people on the left, there are liberal-minded people on the right among libertarians. It's not something that is tied to a left-right worldview. But when I hear people talking about how trying to frame the culture war in terms of left and right, or to say that the culture war doesn't matter and there are more important things, actually this struggle between liberty and authority, which John Stuart Mill talks about in his book on liberty, George Orwell has written about this, that's the thing that matters, and the recognition that there is an authoritarian impulse in humanity, that there is an enduring appeal to authoritarianism, whether you come from the left or from the right. This is something that George Orwell, to go back to him, he tackled this as well. It's precisely the reason why when he wrote Animal Farm, he couldn't get it published for so long, because people were horrified by the possibility that left-wing people could be authoritarian. And what he was saying is that this is something that doesn't, it's irrespective of a left-wing view or a right-wing view. And I think although you might be able to pinpoint psychological differences and tendencies among those on the left who have an authoritarian bent and those on the right who have a similar authoritarian bent, perhaps it's more useful just to think, particularly when it comes to the culture war, in terms of who believes in traditional liberal values. I know that means something very different in America, but liberal values insofar as individual autonomy, shared humanity, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, etc. Those kind of liberal values, you can do whatever you want with your life so long as it does not impinge upon the rights of others. That's something that left and right can agree on. And the social justice warriors, whilst they might call themselves left-wing, really their movement is characterized by authoritarianism. They oppose those liberal values.
That's what it looks like.
And quite, well, not just what it looks like, quite explicitly. I mean, the early critical race theory texts explicitly say, I mean, if you read Derek Bell, he wrote an essay called Who's Afraid of Critical Race Theory? He talks about how critical race theorists have always mistrusted liberalism. They see the liberal project as having failed because we still live in a society where racism exists. And they take that as evidence that liberalism doesn't work rather than...
Right, because the previous societies were so non-racist.
Right, exactly. They don't understand that point, that the social liberalism is about an ongoing process. It's about recognizing that we live in an imperfectible world and trying to do our best with a bad lot. And the problem is that authoritarians tend to be as well kind of utopians, even though in the case of the social justice activists, I don't think they've got a clear sense of what their final ideal society would look like. At the moment, they just seem to me to be on a sort of rampage of destruction. They've problematized... Yeah,
well, that is what it would look. That is what it would look like.
Just a wasteland.
I've always thought that Hitler got exactly what he was aiming at. He shot himself while Europe was burning. And it's like a big fuck you to God, fundamentally.
But that was because he was the personality type that would rather everyone was torn down rather than he fails. I mean, one of the things that comes in...
precisely, yeah. Well, that is the dark tetrad type, man, that's for sure.
I mean, he was deeply narcissistic. He would bore people with those lectures late at night when no one was interested. It was all about him. One thing that comes out very clearly, there's a great biography of Hitler by Ian Kershaw. One thing that very much comes out about that is this guy was a narcissist. And when he knew that the game was up, he wanted everyone to pay.
Yes,
all of the German people
that's
as well.
narcissism right there, man.
Right.
That's absolutely right. Well, and he said that, I mean, near the end of the Second World War, when the Russians were advancing on Berlin, he continually expressed his dismay at the uselessness of the German people who had failed him.
Yes, he could, exactly. And those who had failed on the Eastern Front, or from his perception, had failed, even though he'd put the military in an impossible situation, couldn't take any responsibility for his own mistakes. But that kind of narcissism, and I don't like comparing social justice activists to Hitler. I think that's their trick. That's what they do. They call everyone Hitler. But I think you can definitely see that combination of narcissism and also a kind of religiosity, intolerance, and yes, exactly what you say, a desire to destroy. That if we can't get our way, we'll just destroy everything.
Okay, so let's talk about that. I want to use that as a segue and I haven't tortured you about having a PhD in Renaissance poetry yet. We'll get back to that. I want us to use that as a segue into the religious issue, because you wrote a book here recently. Just make sure I get the title exactly right. The New Puritans, How the Religion of Social Justice Captured the Western World. And so we could talk about religious issues. I've been thinking recently, along the religious lines, let's say, that what we're seeing is just the modern manifestation of an eternal battle. And that battle is laid out first, very early in the biblical corpus, in the story of Cain and Abel. Because what you have in that story is two modes of adaptation, which I think roughly parallel a kind of demented narcissistic authoritarianism and a kind of responsibility-laden individualism. We can discuss that. But what happens is Cain and Abel make sacrifices, right? And that's what people do when they work, because work is the sacrifice of the present to the future. And human beings uniquely work. I mean, maybe beavers work and bees, but look, essentially human beings uniquely work. We're willing to sacrifice the present for the future. Now, what happens in the story of Cain and Abel is that Cain appears to make bloodless and relatively low quality sacrifices, whereas Abel's all in. And the consequence of that is Abel gets rewarded by God and everyone loves him and things go well for him. And Cain, nothing goes his way. And then instead of noticing that maybe he has something to do with that, he calls God out for creating an improper cosmos and really puts him on the stand. And God says, look, buddy, if you got your act together, things would go well for you. And the fact that they're not might have more to do with you than me. And Cain thinks, to hell with you, God. I think I'll go kill your favorite. And so that's the story. And that's one hell of a brutal story. And then, Cain's descendants, including Tubal-Cain, which is about 4 generations down the line, they're the builders of the Tower of Babel and also the first people who make implements of war. So there's an idea there that there's a resentful and bitter, revengeful spirit that preoccupies mankind, and that it can spread out from the individual and take out the entire polity. And I can't help but see a reflection of that on the intellectual landscape now in the political domain. I mean, I think, now I'm curious about what you think about such things, because you have described this new movement, let's say, as religious. So, what do you mean by that? What do you think about these more metaphysical speculations?
I suppose I should be very clear about that. And in the book, I do make it clear. I've called the book The New Puritans, and I refer to the religion of social justice, because one of the things I'm very keen to do, and one of the reasons why I feel that the critical social justice activists are winning, is because a lot of people do not understand their aims, they don't understand what they're about, and that they effectively fall for the linguistic tricks. I mean, you all know that the culture war is largely about who gets to define the meaning of words. Activists often use words but they mean the opposites. They call themselves progressive, for instance, but I believe that they are regressive. They call themselves liberal, but they are deeply illiberal. They're in favor of censorship and authoritarianism. They scream about fascism while they themselves are using fascistic tactics such as violence to silence political opponents. So the language, unless you understand where they're coming from, and unless you understand that theirs is a belief system, which is largely tied to unfalsifiable claims, which depends upon a kind of coterie of high priests, edicts from above, telling the masses what they should believe and punishing those who dissent. It has all the hallmarks of fundamentalist religion, at least the idea of excommunicating heretics, sort of sniffing out heretics, searching for them, and doing the metaphorical equivalent of burning them at the stake, which is what we call cancel culture, destroying their livelihoods, destroying their reputations, a kind of merciless, brutal, cruel and vicious quality, which nonetheless dons the guise of compassion and righteousness. I'm sure that bullies and innately cruel and sociopaths throughout history have probably been attracted to the priesthood because it gives them the opportunity to be a figure of authority, to enact cruelty, and at the same time to be validated as a principled and important member of society. So I think it does.
You mean like Pharisees and scribes, those sorts of people?
Exactly, and I'm not suggesting for a second. If you take something as brutal as the Inquisition, I mean, I'm sure a lot of those people involved felt that they were doing God's work and genuinely thought they were on the side of the angels. But you can be damn sure that there were some psychopaths who were attracted to those positions of power. So when I'm saying that I talk about the religion of critical social justice, I'm doing so to try and make it accessible. I've found that because it is so baffling to everyone, most people are completely baffled because for a start, they have their own kind of esoteric language, this terminology like heteronormativity and toxic masculinity and cisgender, etc. Words that most people just don't even know what they mean. But if you see them as kind of a biblical script or a religious text, And they do have their foundational holy texts, such as Foucault and Judith Butler and things like that. If you make this analogy to religion, I think it makes the movement comprehensible. And I think in order to defeat it, it has to be comprehended. And I think most people can't comprehend it.
So let's try to get at something that might approximate a definition of religious. So this is how I've been thinking about it technically. So imagine that you see the world through a hierarchy of presuppositions, which you have to because you're fundamentally ignorant. You have to presuppose things in order to move forward because you don't have infinite knowledge. So you have to look at the world through a hierarchy of presuppositions. Then you can imagine that some presuppositions are deeper than others. And what that would mean is some presuppositions very few other presuppositions depend on, and some presuppositions many other presuppositions depend on, right? Sort of like, it's like citation depth in the scientific literature. And so freedom of speech, for example, would be a presupposition in a liberal polity upon which almost all other presuppositions rest. So if you move it, you're moving the depths. So a religion specifies the deepest presuppositions, and they have to be axiomatic because that's sort of where your ignorance bottoms out. You have to say, I hold these things to be self-evident before you can proceed.
And that is something like the existence of a deity as a presupposition that has to underpin.
Right, right. Okay, so that's the next issue. So I read a lot of Carl Jung years ago and very deeply. And one of the things Jung said about Protestantism, which I found remarkable, he criticized both Catholicism and Protestantism, as a friendly critic, I would say, pointing out that the temptation that Catholicism might fall prey to is one of centralizing authoritarianism, and the temptation that Protestantism falls prey to is fractionating individualism. He said, the logical conclusion of the Protestant Revolution is that every single person becomes their own church. And so it looks to me like that's happened and what's happened. And psychologists have abetted this. And even the great clinicians, I believe, have abetted this, regardless of my admiration for them, by substituting the self for God. And I think what you have, especially on the psychopathic, narcissistic fringes of what used to be the left, and you see this on the right as well, is the momentary self elevated to the status of God.
Well, you see that an awful lot, which I think is why, I mean, you've identified the narcissism within these kind of movements, but also the rapidity with which they resort to religious terminology or religious ideas or religious modes of expression. For instance, you remember when, was it outside of Netflix, when there were protests against Dave Chappelle's show, and there was that comedian protesting with a sign that said, "We like Dave," or "We like jokes." I think they had signs like that. And one woman cornered him, and it was all caught on film. And she screamed repeatedly in his face, "Repent, motherfucker." She said it again and again and again. And I mentioned that in the book because I love that sort of combined, that combination of rage and religiosity, I think really encapsulates what the movement is all about. I think in terms of the presuppositions of that movement, which it takes as axiomatic, it's not supernatural, okay? It doesn't talk about a deity, even though it has its prophets, I think, from the French post-structuralists of the 1960s. But I think it does have certain axiomatic presuppositions, such as there are power structures that dominate society that underpin all human interaction, and these are based on the notion of group identity, and that is how society needs to be understood. As Foucault talked about grids of power through society, power not being a top-down phenomenon, something that sort of is latent within all of our interactions and behavior. And they see that these activists believe that they can pick this apart and understand it and remedy the wrongs in society, so long as they can identify where the power structures lie and who is exercising privilege at the expense of the oppressed. That's why critical race theorists, I mean, it was put like this in James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose's book, that the key question that you ask if you are a critical race theorist is not did racism take place in this situation, but how did racism manifest in this situation?
Yes, right.
So it's almost like a ghostly spiritual thing that is always there. I think that's one of their That's one of their major presuppositions. The other
so here's another way of thinking about that from the religious perspective. I mean, Milton's Satan is an authoritarian narcissist, and he rules over hell. And so he's a figure that's very much analogous to Mao or to Stalin, right? He's someone who climbs the most pathological possible power hierarchy and then regards himself as a victor, even though he's actually the biggest loser. And so Satan is the spirit, you might say, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, who rules the world by force. Now, the postmodern neo-Marxist types believe that there's nothing but power. So I can't see that that's any different than a certain Christian heresy that rose up in the Middle Ages, making the claim that Satan himself was the ruler of the earth, right? Because the notion there is that power itself is the only, or at least the ultimate motivator motivator is the right way of thinking about it. And then it follows, a lot of things follow from that, right? One thing that follows from that is that there's no such thing as free speech, because there's just conflicts between different claims to power. And that if you promote free speech, that's just an indication of how conniving you are to use that entire philosophical language to do nothing but buttress your own colonialist power claims.
Yes, because their theories always put you in that position where you can't win. You know, it's similar with critical race theory. They have their notion of interest convergence. You know, when people say, well, there are extremely successful black individuals in our history, Barack Obama, say, someone like that, they will say the only reason that those people have succeeded is because it was in the interests of white people for them to succeed. In other words, if black people don't succeed, right, so if black people don't succeed in society, that's evidence of critical race theorists' claims. But if they do succeed, it's also evidence of their claims, because that's interest convergence. So they keep putting you in this kind of situation. That, to me, has to be religion without, as in religious belief that has not been, it has merely been asserted rather than proven. The fact that they take on the very notion of rationality, Enlightenment ideas, the fact that they think that those things are even part, and they also see that through group identity, that is just the product of some dead white men in Paris.
So how do you understand, there seems to be, okay, so we figure we've got a couple of, what would you say, contenders for deity. One would be Satan himself, right? The spirit of power. The other would be the untrammeled hedonic self. It's something like that. But then there's a weird paradox there, not that the paradox bothers the postmodern types, that group identity is paramount, but full licentiousness on the personal front and the granting of every whim on the personal front is also requisite. And I can't quite square that coherently. Like, how is it that the radicals can push forward the notion that group identity is the only identity, but also push forward the notion that everything possible is to be permitted, every individual at every moment?
But you put your finger on it when you said that the paradoxes don't trouble the postmodernists. You know, it's sort of built into their whole idea. When Derrida was writing, he was trying to write incoherently. You know, it's part of it.
Too.
He did manage. It's absolutely unreadable. So let me try and understand what you're saying here. You were talking about the idea.
Well, we see this worship of the self.
Well, you're talking about.
So there's contenders for God, right? We have power and we have the self, and then there's an element of that spreads out into identity. Now, the radical types definitely put forward group identity as paramount, and yet they worship the self.
What do you mean by licentiousness? What do you mean by? Do they believe that absolutely everything is permissible? That any kind of individual desire is able to be fulfilled? Because in their world, I think they're quite prescriptive, aren't they, about which modes of behavior are acceptable and which aren't?
Well, that gets extraordinarily complex, because it looks to me, one of the things I see on campuses, for example, is the insistence on the left progressive front, let's say, that any form of sexual identity or behavior whatsoever is permissible. And not only permissible, but to be celebrated. But now it's complicated, because at the same time, right, every single interaction between young man and a young woman is so absolutely dangerous that it has to be subjected to contractual validation
That's what I mean.
before it can
That's what I
proceed.
mean.
Well, it's a weird psychoanalytic truism, that if you go too far in one direction, you simultaneously go too far in the other. And that really muddies up the water, right? So the really narcissistic types, for example, have an extremely uncertain core.
Yes.
Right. But that doesn't make them any less, what would you say, forthright in their claims that they should rule.
But
so
I don't
you
think
can't stretch your, go ahead.
Well, I'm not so sure that it's about fulfilling any indulgence, no matter how depraved. I think it's more about what they call queering society. I think it's more about if it is in the service of demolishing the cis, white, heteropatriarchal structures that are in place, then that is seen as a benefit, as something positive.
Right. So you think that licentiousness serves the purposes of demolition?
I do.
What about the reverse hypothesis? Is that, because I would say this might be more true of Foucault, all the demolition was put forward to license the licentiousness. Like, I don't know. I mean, this is a real question.
I'm not sure about that. I mean, a lot of people will say that because Foucault has, as you know, a very shady past.
Yeah, you might say that.
Yeah, absolutely. And people have pointed out that there seems to be a strong correlation between some of the founding postmodernists and, shall we say, depraved sexual activity, sometimes pedophilia, these kinds of things. The question, I suppose, are you suggesting that they created this kind of theoretical framework in order to justify that sort of behavior? Is that what you mean?
Well, I'm not. I waver, and maybe the causality is interactive, because you could see. I see a lot of stunningly immature behavior on the radical front from a developmental psychological perspective. So, for example, a lot of the behavior I see looks to me like unsocialized 2-year-old behavior, because 2-year-olds are highly prone to motivational and emotional whims in the short term, and they're incapable of developing a shared frame of reference. That doesn't happen until kids are 3. And aggressive 2-year-olds who don't develop that by 4 never develop it in their entire life, because they become alienated and they don't make friends and they can't further their development. And so you could say, if this is sort of a Freudian id-like view, that part of what we're seeing is the expression of extremely unsocialized, immature motivational and emotional demands, fragmented with a what would you say, temper tantrum-like insistence, constant insistence that those whims be granted immediately. And then you could say, well, the entire power critique has been erected on the intellectual front just to justify that. Although you could also reverse it and say, no, the licentiousness, which was the case you were making, the licentiousness is promoted because it's revolutionary in a sense, and it can be used to demolish these so-called traditional power structures.
Well, it has to be, because they just have so many impositions on other people's freedoms. They have so many ideas of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, particularly in the arts, in film, in plays, in books, that, they're for censorship. They believe that things that are that horrible word they use, problematic, and they like to problematize things. So it can't be the case that they just believe in a kind of global free-for-all. It can't be that, because I think they come across more like Pharisees to me than anything else. But maybe what you're describing in terms of the temper tantrums and the things that we see from these people is that is just simply the natural consequence of when you have decades of academics and figures of authority saying that we ought to prioritize our emotional responses and our own subjective view of the world over objective epistemological frameworks.
Or actual practical responsibility. I mean, I saw this at the University of Toronto. It was one of the things that constantly made me morally ill, was that my idiot compatriots thought that the best thing to do with young people was to teach them to protest rather than to help them figure out how to make their way responsibly and productively and generously in the world,
they've created a generation that are infantile. I mean, it is an infantilized world, and we see it in absolutely every strand of our culture and politics as well. And it's because, as you say, academics, by and large, are activists first and academics second. Helen Pluckrose traces that to what she calls the applied turn of postmodernism, late 80s. Postmodernists for many years were quite enjoyed sort of theorizing and frolicking about, coming up with these airy-fairy ideas, not applying them to society, not seriously saying we should, reconstruct society and apply these methods. And then the applied postmodernists said, no, actually, we can actually change society, revolutionize society through the application of our untested theories and highly contested theories. And they did it. And what's so tragic is is that it eventually worked. We're now in a situation where our government over here, the government certainly in Canada and in the US, they are implementing these ideas, these highly contested theories in public policy, in the educational system.
Yes, they're making them mandatory. Yeah. Well, that was
Right.
That was what propelled me into the public domain to begin with. Was the first move of that sort on the Trudeau Liberal government front.
But that's
mandated speech.
But that's why surely it does merit the analogy with religion, because you are imposing on society ideas that are based on belief, simply based on belief. There is no evidence that reorganizing society in the way that the critical race theorists would like to do, so that we have a hyper-racialized society that focuses first and foremost on your group identity and secondarily on who you are as an individual. There's no evidence that this is making society less racist,
So we seem to have agreed that the desire for demolition and destruction rules paramount even over the desire for untrammeled personal, say, self-expression.
I think that is inevitable when you come from the supposition that society is inherently broken, that it is undergirded by power structures that only support the already privileged. That's
okay. So let's dive into that, because this is a good place to further interrogate the left issue. So, a lot of the people that I talk with, Russell Brand and Joe Rogan, Brett Weinstein, those are good. Eric Weinstein, those are good initial exemplars, are more classical leftist types, and yet they're identified by the screaming radicals as gateways to the alt-right, which is extraordinarily interesting, because it means as soon as you're no longer a useful idiot, from the radical perspective, you're instantly a Nazi, which is very convenient for them. But here's the thing. The postmodern critique that society is to be understood as nothing but the manifestation of power is attractive, partly because when social arrangements or even psychological arrangements pathologize, they do pathologize in the direction of power, right? So if you can tyrannize yourself like an overlord, you can tyrannize your partner, you can tyrannize your family and your community, you can act like a tyrant on the local political stage and then nationally, right? You can do that in business as well. And that happens relatively often. So there's a core of sense in the claim that power is a powerful motivating force. Now, I think the radicals go too far when they say everything is about power, because, well, everything is a lot of things, and you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But the problem the left therefore has, if the left is willing to be reasonable and say, well, some social structures are corrupted by power, then the left has to figure out, and can't, because I've asked like 50 senators and Republican and congressmen on the Democrat side to do this. If your leftist stance is that power corrupts society, then how in the world can you tell when those who make that claim take that claim too far? And I've asked, like, the reason I brought up the Democrat, the senators and the congressmen, is because I asked every lefty I could get my hands on, and that's been quite a few over the last 5 years, when the left goes too far. And I even asked Robert Kennedy that recently, and he said, well, I'm trying to run a campaign based on unity, and so I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. It's like, well, the barbarians are at your gate, buddy. They've been canceling you for 18 years. So how do we separate out this?
Well, there are so many things that you've raised there. I mean, firstly, you're right to identify that there is a kernel in truth of truth in the postmodernist claims that power is important. It is significant in human behavior and society and history. All of that is absolutely accurate. And you're also right that where they go wrong is to assume that everything is about power. Like you say, power is really important, but it's not everything. And I wonder whether reducing everything to just power structures makes things understandable, easier in a way.
Yeah, it does. Well, we found the best predictor in our first study, the best predictor of left-wing authoritarianism was low verbal intelligence.
Right. Because people want easy answers.
Absolutely. And power is a good, easy answer, right?
Well,
it covers a lot of territory.
Any ideology is, because it means that you're outsourcing your thinking to a set of rules. And that is what is happening. But that's why all those people that you've tried to ask this question, what happens when the left goes too far in terms of their own megalomania? They won't answer the question, because to do so would be to acknowledge that there is a flaw in their ideology. There's a potential flaw in their system, that they're dealing ultimately with human beings. To go back to Orwell, it's the same reason why the Stalinists have never forgiven Orwell. All these people on the left have always hated him for pointing out that the left is just as susceptible to corruption as the right is. And they've never forgiven him for that. And it comes down to that idea of moral purity. I mean, one of the reasons I call them the new Puritans, again, it's an analogy. It's trying to make them accessible. It's because in their world, to deviate even slightly from this very simplistic formula that they've applied to society to give them power, ironically enough, to put them in a position where they can control other people, but also can control their own understandings, comprehensions of the world, because they've got this framework through which they can look at it. And to say, well, actually, your framework is flawed in all sorts of ways, that's harder, because then you have to start thinking. And they don't want to start thinking. Thinking is the death of ideology. I think that's why you're getting that moral purity, but it's also why, I mean, you mentioned, interestingly, people like Joe Rogan and Russell Brand being considered a gateway to the alt-right. They're still traditionally, politically, more akin to the left, I would say, than the right. But because they've deviated slightly, you have this kind of puritanical sledgehammer coming down and saying, no, you're straying from what our ideology says you should believe. And that, to me, also feels like a fundamentalist religion. It feels like, and I'm making the distinction clearly between a religion and a fundamentalist religion, because I think even within Catholicism, the Vatican has always encouraged debate, theological debate and discussion. It's not as though they just give you the catechism and say, that's it. There's all these kinds of discussions and debates and nuances being teased out in theological thoughts. Theologians for centuries have done that. But with fundamentalist religion, that doesn't happen. It doesn't happen with ISIS, for instance. You don't get the sort of leaders of ISIS sitting around cross-legged in their caves saying, well, let's decide whether we're right about this fine theological point. That doesn't happen. So what scares me, I think, about the critical social justice movement is that they are like a fundamentalist religion. For some reason, I mean, this is why, and you know this, whenever you meet one of these people, whenever you encounter them online, get into some kind of discussion, you know what their opinions are on absolutely everything.
Yes.
And
it's like turning a crank on someone's head.
I've never been surprised by them. I'd like to be surprised once in a while. I've had a few occasions recently where I've got into conversation. I fall for it. You should just block them, really, because they're not people who can be reasoned with. But every now and then I take the bait and I say, okay, what is it you think I've said? What has upset you? What is the perspective that I have that you disagree with, and why? And they can't do it. They just come back screaming Nazi or whatever. And then you think, okay, well, I shouldn't have bothered trying. But they never surprise me. I just wish they would, because if you're not thinking for yourself and challenging your own ideas, if you're not coming from the basis, from humility, if you're not coming to the world on the understanding that you're probably wrong about an awful lot of things, I don't think you're fully human in a way. I think you're like an automaton. You're just following a code, a script.
You're possessed by a principality.
Right. I find that I find that disturbing.
Okay, so let me hassle you about something else. I tweeted out at Richard Dawkins here recently, and I talked to Richard Dawkins, and I actually admire Richard Dawkins. I liked his books. They taught me a lot, and some of his essays too. And I think Dawkins is a real scientist in that he believes there is truth, and that the pursuit of the truth will set you free, which, by the way, is a religious claim, but he still believes that. In any case, I also think that Dawkins and Harris and the rest of the new atheists helped pave the landscape for this new woke catastrophe, because it's a humanistic movement fundamentally. And it's radically anti-science. And I think that Dawkins, well, I know Dawkins sees that because I've been watching his tweets and I did talk to him. And it's certainly the case that the woke mob, I think, can take out science even more easily than they can take out the vestiges of Judeo-Christian thought. And they're definitely going to do that. So now Dawkins and his coterie looked at the history of the West and they said, well, we should dispense with that medieval superstition and we should progress down the Enlightenment trail. And I've talked to Douglas Murray about this. Now, the problem with that, it seems to me, so Jung said something very interesting as well that I'll bring up. He implied that Catholicism, with all its strange mysticism and dreamlike propositional structure, was as sane as people got. Like that in order for people to function psychologically and to exist together socially, the belief system that united them had to have a dreamlike quality. Okay, so, and that now the new atheist types would say, well, no, we can replace all that mumbo jumbo and darkness and occult mysticism with a clear-headed rationality. But what I see happening instead, and this is on the religious front, is that in the aftermath of the death of God, what we've seen reemerge is either a form of worship of power or a degeneration into a kind of polytheistic paganism, not a move forward to Enlightenment-type Dawkins rationality. Quite the contrary. And so one of the things I'm curious, I know Murray is uncomfortable about this. Douglas Murray is uncomfortable about this. If the woke movement is a religion, and if it's a dangerous religion, is the alternative to that no religion, or is the alternative to that whatever might constitute genuine religion? What do you think about that?
Well, I think there is clearly something within humanity that we require a certain satisfaction from some kind of belief system which is outside of ourselves, or a sense that there is something beyond ourselves. I suppose you might call it transcendence. I think there is a need for that. I think that I get that through the arts. I think that's why we create things. That's why we are creative beings, which is also why I think the woke movement is threatened by the arts and seeks to curtail it and actually to transform it into just another propagandizing tool, because it fundamentally doesn't understand what art is. So it is interesting to me, though, to have noted that the new atheist movement, the one that you describe, they seem now to have evolved into the most woke of all, the humanist society. Right. Yeah, there's something about them that they bought into gender identity ideology very quickly, probably before other bodies did. And the humanist society in the UK now is fully paid up in that really quasi-religious belief system. The idea of a sexed or gendered soul that doesn't match your biological form. How is that anything other than religious? Then actually, how is it anything other than supernatural? Really, So I think, of course. So, but it has been interesting to me that those were the very people, the people who were talking about rationality and to sort of claw back the primacy of Enlightenment values, that they are the ones who've been most susceptible of all. Of course, this is what has got Dawkins in trouble. Right.
Recently. That's a stunningly devastating observation, right? Because if it turns out that those who wanted to walk down the mass Enlightenment pathway produced children who were most susceptible to woke ideology, that's a pretty damning bit of evidence for the validity of that approach. As far as I'm trying to look at it.
Well, because it's always concerned me that some of my most intelligent friends and acquaintances have fallen for the woke movement. In other words, you talk about the fact that they have a lot of the activists are very infantile in their behavior, and yet some of the smartest people in society seem to buy into it. It has the capacity to infect everyone. It perhaps because it isn't responsive to intellectual rigor. It exists regardless of that. Then
that begs the question of why it attracts the intelligent types that you're describing. I mean, look, it originated in the bloody academy. It didn't originate. Hypothetically, it originated not only in the academy, but in the core of the academy that was most preoccupied with the humanities, right? So it obviously appeals to the intellect, let's say.
Or is it just that we all have the capacity to become, to to fall for hysteria? Is it possible that we're just all, I mean, look, my book opens with a discussion of Salem, the witch hunts in Salem. And one of the key things about that, the more I read about it, and the more I was fascinated by the fact that it was these figures in authority, it was the ministers, the judges, it was the highly intelligent in the community who were the ones who were pushing this. I mean, the girls were screaming and crying witch and pointing and saying that the devil was everywhere and they'd seen people sign the devil's book and all of that kind of thing. I see those girls as analogous with the screaming anime activists online who just shout Nazi everywhere. They see Nazis everywhere. The girls saw witches everywhere. I see that as very, very similar. But it would have gone away if the ministers and the judges said, no, this isn't rational. You're wrong. There's no evidence for your claims. We have to move on. But they didn't. They went along with it. That's why people ended up being executed. It's when figures in authority capitulate to the screaming of the children. You've described the children, the activists as children. The activists themselves, I would posit, are not the problem. If they were all out there with their billboards,
it's the enablers.
It's the enablers. It's the politicians.
Okay.
The people in charge.
So one of the things you see as the biblical corpus unfolds itself symbolically is an emerging relationship between the figure of Cain, and so that's that bitter figure who's out for revenge, and the figure of the, what would you call it, untrammeled intellect. So for example, very rapidly after the Cain and Abel story, you have the story of the Tower of Babel. And what you see there are emperors who are competing to replace God, right? They're building towers that are ever and ever higher, predicated on the proposition that they could build a tower all the way to heaven, so that's like Jacob's ladder, and thereby replace God. Then you have, Milton's meditations on Lucifer. Lucifer is the highest angel of God's heavenly kingdom, who's gone most wrong. And he's a stellar example of the untrammeled intellect, and I kind of see this in the new atheist movement too. It's like, we're so smart that our theories can replace the transcendent. Now, your way out of that, I think you just told me, your way out of that is your involvement on the aesthetic front with the arts, right?
I think so. Well, there are two ways.
Yeah.
There's also humility. I think I come back to that point. What you're describing is hubris, and that's something which is common, particularly common among intelligent people, I think.
Right, absolutely. It's the cardinal sin of the intellect is hubris.
Yes, exactly. But yes, the arts, I think, are I suppose, our way out if they are sustained, because they satisfy that human need to understand ourselves and to explore ourselves and to interrogate our existence. It's so important, therefore, that the arts aren't curtailed in the way that they currently are being done.
Okay, so let me ask you a question about that. I agree with that. I mean, I see that the signal power of beauty, especially manifested in music, for me, speaks of something that's truly transcendent. So here's a question for you. So is there a superordinate unity at which the arts aim? And is that unity not equivalent to the monotheistic spirit? I know this is a major question, right? I'm throwing out a major question.
It is a major question.
Something makes the arts, right? It's their movement towards beauty. What beauty and unity, transcendence. But
Yes.
Are the arts unified? Are they the manifestation of a unitary spirit? And I see that unitary spirit is what I think is the antithesis of power.
I couldn't profess to know. And I think a lot of people have attempted to define even what art is. And I think people have failed. I've always liked Zola's definition of art as life seen through a temperament. The idea that what the artist does is attempts to present to you his view of the way that he sees the world, on the understanding that we all see the world differently. And there is something quite beautiful about that, about expressing ourselves artistically.
But it's not just variety. You know, it's not just variety, because there are qualitative distinctions between presentations of worldview. So, I mean, Dostoevsky trumps 50 Shades of Grey, right? Because there's a hierarchy of rank, right? And the greatest artists occupy the highest rank. And that is what tilts them more towards that transcendent unity. I think it's something like that.
Well, yeah, that's absolutely right. It's genius, isn't it? Genius.
Yes, right.
That's how the canon is formed. I mean, the canon is, I think academics like to think that they're the ones who select what is in the canon. The canon is formed through influence, through to what extent other great artists borrow and imitate and innovate on the back of
that's
other
that same
artists.
Depth of presupposition that I was describing earlier, right?
But yes.
The more fundamental a text is, the more other texts depend on it.
But the reason that artists do that is because obviously people like Michelangelo, Brahms, Dickens, Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, all of these are clearly the pinnacles of human achievement. They're achieving something that most of us simply cannot do. All we can do is look in awe at what they have achieved, and other artists look in awe at that and try to come close to it, or at least, or in some cases of extreme genius, build upon it. And that is
right. So
maybe it is satisfying something fundamental.
Well, there's a cardinal observation, because the hypothesis that you just put forward is something like the purpose of art is to, what would you say, to provoke the emulation of greatness, and that's based on the hypothesis that there is something transcendent that's great. And that's that unity that I think that the arts are striving toward. And
I don't know. I don't think it's conscious like that. I don't think that we.
I don't think so either.
And I all I can say is that artists, I think, great art provokes something of the numinous in us.
Right.
And whether that's religious or spiritual or godly or whatever, I don't know. But it's something.
Well, I think it is sort of by definition. Right. I mean, you know what I mean? It's like, well, if that's not religious, then what is? Dogma? It's certainly religious on the experiential front.
Yes, I suppose what I mean is it doesn't point to the existence of God necessarily. It just points to the existence of something beyond ourselves that we require in order to have a satisfactory life.
That sounds a lot like God.
Okay. Well, that would be depending on.
I'm not trying to be picky,
No, I know.
Well, that's the thing, man, because it is a matter of definition. Like I don't think God, this transcendent unity that I've been tapping towards here, is something like the central animating spirit of mankind at its best. It's something like that. Now, you might say, well, is that real? And that's not a good question, because you can't ask that question without bringing an a priori set of presuppositions about what constitutes real to bear on the question. Like, is it the same reality as the materialist atheists claim most real? Probably not.
No.
But that doesn't mean it's not real. It just means we can't agree on what constitutes real. Well, we can't agree on what constitutes a woman, so that's not surprising.
Well, then let's suggest then that, or let's agree that the critical social justice movement is essentially godless. I think it is godless. It has no yearning after that sense of the numinous, and it has no capacity to produce it. That's why no great art has ever been produced from. Can you name a single woke activist who has produced a great work of art in any medium or any genre? Because I can't. I don't think.
Okay, so that's a very interesting observation. What is it? The gospel statement: "By their fruits you will know them." So if they bear nothing but bitter fruit, then you might think they're worshiping the wrong God, or in your case, they're no God. But right, that was your criticism of the woke types. I think they worship power as a god, but whatever, we're close enough on that, so we don't have to discuss it. So let's talk about the artistic front here, because I see the scientists being mowed down like grass under a lawnmower by the woke activists, and that's going to continue, because the real scientists don't have a political bone in their body and they have no idea what's coming for them. But I'm particularly sickened by the bloody artists, because the only thing they have to offer is this connection to the truly numinous. And that's true across art forms, right? They point to the numinous, and they're willing increasingly to subordinate that to ideology, or to remain silent in the face of this onslaught to bolster their moral self-righteousness.
Yeah, that's
they're
really
cutting
difficult.
their own throats.
It's horrible to watch. It's horrible to witness, because artistic genius can only come about by those who can think outside the box, who can, who are not conformists, ultimately. This is a movement that demands conformity, and artists of all people are the ones who are going along with it. Now, to an extent, I suppose that's always happened, though. I mean, it must have always happened, because artists have to get on with the business of living. back in my era, the Renaissance period, the area that I studied for my doctorate, you had patrons. You had patrons of the arts in society who would effectively say to William Shakespeare, for instance, when King James patronized William Shakespeare's company, the King's Men, it went from being the Lord Chamberlain's Men to the King's Men, and he said they were patronized, but they could write. Shakespeare could write whatever he wanted. Right, the great patrons are the ones who don't try to steer the artist in a certain way. I mean, sure, you would get, for instance, at the start of Shakespeare's narrative poem Venus and Adonis, you have this, this sort of sycophantic passage about the person to whom it is dedicated, Henry Wriothesley, the Earl, and that's because Shakespeare also needed to live at that point. He wasn't yet a rich man at that point. He became very, very rich ultimately, but at that point he wasn't. So artists do require an income, and in our day and age, in order for an artist to be employed, they have to satisfy a set of demands by the gatekeepers of various industries. That's theatre, the publishing industry, comedy industry, television, executives, commissioners, all of those kind of things. The problem is that at the moment, all of those people are entirely captured by the woke ideology. They are all its foot soldiers, or at least even in some cases, I suppose you could call them its clergy. And so they make these demands to artists. And I suppose, unless you are independently wealthy, what choice have you? In other words, what this thing does is we can't all be a Van Gogh living in complete poverty, doing whatever the hell he wanted.
Well, that's a very sympathetic account, and I have some sympathy for that account because I've seen people, many people who faced the threat of cancellation.
Yes.
And are terrified by it, not least often because they have a family to support, let's say. But let me push back on that a little bit. And you tell me if you think there's any flaws in this. Okay, so look, as far as I can tell, your best bet in life is to play the most transcendent, iterable strategy. And because you're going to pay a price for what you do. No matter what you do, you're going to pay, in fact, you're going to pay the ultimate price no matter what you do. So you're already screwed in the fundamental analysis. Now, and that means that the fact that you're going to pay means that you're always confronted with a choice. And the choice is to say what you believe to be true and take the consequences, or to fail to say what you believe to be true and take the consequences. Now, people will say, well, I don't want to speak right now because look at the consequences. And I would say, well, that's always why people have lied throughout history, is to avoid the consequences or to get something they don't deserve. And so I could say, from the judgment perspective rather than the mercy perspective, especially to artists, it's like, I don't give a damn about your financial need. The only thing you have to offer the world is the purity of your vision. And if you sacrifice that, well, you're killing the goose that lays the golden eggs. And you might be protected in the short term, but they're going to come for you in the future.
But maybe a lot of these creative people are thinking to themselves, I will play the game as far as I need to so that I can establish myself and then I can make my own artistic choices. That's happened many times.
Doesn't work. That's what the faculty did. They said over and over as they rose up the ladder from graduate student to professor, well, once I have tenure, I'll be brave. It's like, that isn't how it works. You don't get braver because you're more... okay, so you didn't do that. So why didn't you do it?
So look, I completely share your sense of dismay, and particularly from artists. I think the world of academia is rather more careerist, I think, and so although I think it's just as unforgivable, it's more understandable. I think to be an artist, you have to be the kind of person whose sole fealty is to your muse. It has to be that, otherwise you're not really an artist in any serious sense at all. You have to be creating what it is you are personally impelled to create. Whatever drives you. And there are some people who have done that in history. William Blake is a good example. William Blake was poor throughout his life, died in poverty, and he could see all these mediocre people playing the game and becoming rich, but he couldn't do it. He was too much of an authentic artist. He wasn't able to do that. And I wish all artists could have that. But the other thing about that is actually very few people are great artists. Most people are sort of peddlers of popular culture or, kind of functional hacks, the people who can produce the entertainment that actually we do really need and require. That, like, I'm not trying to denigrate popular culture. I think it's really, really important, but it's not the same as great art, right? So that pop music, I really enjoy pop music, but I don't pretend to myself that it's Brahms. You know, we have those hierarchies. Hierarchies, by the way, which the woke would like to tear down and say that's all about the implementation of power again and the implementation of privilege. They will say there's no difference between
There's no such thing as quality.
No, exactly, because it's all about subjective feeling. And they would say that there's no difference between an Elton John song and a Beethoven symphony. They'll say there's no difference there. It's just about, and to pretend that there is a problem in and of itself. And that's why I think there are two things. The way that artists could really be supported in this partly comes from academia, partly comes from literary theorists and people who, by the way, I think have completely lost the plot. But they need to retain the primacy of the canon, of the Western canon. They need to say, actually, there are certain works of art that are greater than others. They need to be able to be bold enough to say that, rather than stripping away Chaucer or Shakespeare or Marlowe or whatever from the canon to make way for mediocre writers who happen to represent a marginalized group identity.
Well, I see in that, again, this emergence of the spirit of Cain, because Cain, imagine you're a mediocre artist, wannabe, and part of the reason for that maybe isn't so much that you're talentless, although that might have something to do with it, but that you're unwilling to say a true word or to paint a true brushstroke. You're too cowardly, so you're not going anywhere. Okay, so you're getting irritated and resentful because your sacrifices aren't being appreciated by God. And so what do? Well, if you're Cain, you destroy your own ideal. Right? Because that's what Cain says to God, my punishment is more than I can bear. Now, that's a very ambiguous phrase because you can't tell exactly what he refers to. But as far as I can tell, what he means is, well, I've really spent my whole life miserable and jealous because I'm not able, and I want to be more than anything else. And now I've gone and killed my own ideal. And so how can I live? I've killed my own ideal. Well, that's what these bloody woke artists, wannabe types are doing.
It's not just even the woke. This predates the woke. Harold Bloom the great literary theorist, used to write about the critical theorists, the identitarian theorists of the 90s as being the theorists of resentment. That's what he called them. I think that's exactly right. It started way back in the 60s with feminist writers trying to problematize writers such as D.H. Lawrence or Norman Mailer or whoever it might be, Ernest Hemingway, whatever, saying that these writers are sexist. I mean, when I was studying as an undergraduate for English literature, you basically got the highest marks if you problematized texts. If you went through a play and teased out the homophobic elements or the racist elements, you'd get rewarded almost like you were a kind of moral detective. And I think it all started there. It goes way back to that.
Well, so then I would say that's part of the prideful hubris of the intellect. So you have these second-rate creative wannabes in English departments, let's say, and instead of worshiping the spirit of Shakespeare, which is what they should properly be doing and transmitting that to students, they elevate their critical capacity over and above the creative capacity of the artist, lay moral claim to the integrity of their arguments, and then propagandize to the students, and who pay $50,000 a year for the privilege.
Which is why I go back to humility, because I think the only sensible or intelligent approach to Shakespeare is humility. Similarly, when we saw recently the publishing house, which publishing house was it that decided to rewrite P.G. Wodehouse's novels? P.G. Wodehouse is the greatest comic prose stylist in the English language. The idea that a group of 20-something activists in a publishing house think that they can write better than Wodehouse, think that they can improve his work by this sort of horrendous, bowdlerized version.
Especially morally.
Of course, morally. It's all based on morals. So it's so infuriating. I mean, it makes me very, very angry because it's the arrogance of that that I find absolutely stunning. But similarly with productions of Shakespeare. So there's I just saw a review the other day for a production of Julius Caesar by the Royal Shakespeare Company. By all accounts, it's just an identitarian mess. It's just it's taking the play and just reshaping it to promote voguish ideas that are in fashion at the moment about group identity and the primacy of group identity and power structures, etc. And therefore, they're missing the entire play. And as an audience member, this is why I think it's better to read Shakespeare at this point, because as an audience member, you are subject to whatever interpretation the director wants to impose on it. And if that director is really a preacher in disguise, then you're just going to get a sermon, not a play. That seems to me what's happening over and over again. I saw today, actually, there was an article about Macbeth. University?
Trigger warning.
It's a trigger warning on Macbeth at the university in Belfast, Queen's University in Belfast, right? Now, those people are studying a module on Shakespeare, and it's actually even a secondary module. They already have a decent knowledge of the subject. This is like an advanced module where they are to really get into the weeds with this great writer. And to put a trigger warning in that is to say that the way that we need to perceive these great texts is through our particularly obsessive, moralistic, identitarian lens, and that we have to see them as morally dangerous texts, potentially dangerous texts.
Maybe they're exactly right on that front, because if you are a woke propagandist, there is nothing more dangerous to you than the spirit of Shakespeare.
Sure. And there is something dangerous, actually, particularly about Macbeth, I think, because in Macbeth, I think Macbeth is one of Shakespeare's greatest plays. And I think one of the reasons why I always found it disturbing, even as a child, even though I didn't really know why I found it disturbing as a child, because it's one of those that gets on school text because it's such a short one. But actually, when you watch it, it isn't like Shakespeare created so many sort of great embodiments of evil, people like Iago in Othello, or Edmund in King Lear, or Aaron in Titus Andronicus, these figures. But Macbeth is different, because with Macbeth, you go along with Macbeth knowing that it could be you. I think it's the closest to what, when you write about Solzhenitsyn talking about the line of good and evil cutting through the heart of every man, that to me is Macbeth, because Macbeth is like this incredible study into, or representation of, what if we lived in a world where we didn't have free will? Macbeth knows everything he is doing is wrong and cannot stop it from happening. And that's, it's like when you're watching it, if you're watching a good production of Macbeth, you are Macbeth, right? And you're falling into this vortex. That's why I think.
Well, that's actually like a definition of great literature. I think literature almost always portrays something like a romantic adventure, and then something like the battle of good against evil, depending on how that's laid out, right?
Yes.
It's a romantic battle of good against evil. Okay, but the great literary authors place that battle in the soul of a single individual, right? So that each character contains the entire landscape of the cosmic battle, instead of there being some characters parsed out as good and other characters parsed out as villainous. And so then when you sit in the audience and you experience that, you're experiencing the divine drama in your own soul.
And that is disturbing, right?
Let me throw you something at you. So I went to Jerusalem with Jonathan Pageau, and Pageau is about the deepest religious thinker I ever encountered. And he was a postmodernist for a good while, and so is expert in that domain as well, which makes him a particularly vicious critic now of the postmodernist types. Anyways, we walked the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem. And what that is, if you imagine a tragic story, and then you embody that, and the ultimate tragic story is the worst possible thing happening to the best possible person, right? That's the pinnacle towards which all tragedy strives, you might say. And walking the Via Dolorosa is a exercise in literary experience, because the point of that pilgrimage, so to speak, is to place yourself not only in the role of the recipient of all that brutality, but also in the role of the deliverer of the brutality, right? To imagine yourself as the mob, as yourself as the best friend who betrays, as the intellectually hubristic Pharisee and scribe, as the hapless ruler of Rome. That's all you. And that's what literature does. It walks you through that. And I think Macbeth and plays of that magnitude are threatening to the woke types, most particularly because they do require that pilgrimage of moral inquiry, and that does upset the ideological apple cart. So they hate art. They hate art because it pushes past propaganda always.
Exactly, and that's why the Passion of the Christ is the most powerful story and the most enduring story, not story, but account of the brutality that we, I mean, when you read about the experience of Jesus on the way to Calvary, can any of us be sure that we wouldn't be among the jeering mobs throwing the stones?
No, we can be sure we would be. We can be certain we would be. Yeah.
The woke don't agree with that, do they? Because the woke like to judge the past. And they will say that if I had lived in the antebellum South, if I'd have lived in the Civil War, I would have been the ones trying to free the slaves. I wouldn't have been a slave owner. I wouldn't have been one of those people who supported racial segregation. But of course they would. And in fact, they would have been the first ones to do it because they can't think outside the box.
All right. So I've been thinking about this mythological motif of the harrowing of hell. So what happens in this ultimate tragedy is that, well, first of all, the best possible person is put to death by the worst possible people in the worst possible way. And you might think, well, that's as bad as it gets, right? Because sort of by definition, that's as bad as it gets. But you know, that isn't as bad as it gets. And that's pretty awful because, you know, you just pointed to something, is that if you're looking at history and you have any bloody sense, you think, I wouldn't have been a victim or a hero, I would have been a perpetrator, because most people were perpetrators, although, you know, there were plenty of victims. I would have been a perpetrator. And so then when you realize that you likely would have been a perpetrator and that you probably are at the moment, unbeknownst to yourself, well, then you're facing something, I think, that is in some ways worse than death. I think it's hell. I actually think that is that you have to understand that there is a part of you that would willingly dwell in hell before you can rescue yourself from it at all. You know, and I think that's what we're called to do in the aftermath of the 20th century and the horrors of Auschwitz, to wake up and think, oh my God, there's something inside us that's so malevolent that to gaze upon it for a second is to suffer from nightmares for the rest of your life, but that's also your moral obligation. And that seems to me what the harrowing of hell is, right? It's the descent through death into the realm of malevolence itself, and to take that onto yourself.
So when
God, that's a horrible
when the
thing.
woke try to police art, apply trigger warnings to art, censor it, remove scenes, etc., are they, in your view, attempting to prevent that experience, that necessary human experience of confronting the worst possible version of yourself? Is that what they're doing?
That's what it looks like to me. I mean, I think they're protecting themselves from chaotic complexity, but that also denies them possibility. So that's terrible, and hope. But more importantly, they're trying to shuffle off the responsibility of confronting Satan in the desert.
So there's something, well, I mean, there's something quite understandable about all of that, isn't there? Because it is uncomfortable. Sure. I mean, people have done this with the arts forever. When I mean, one of the most interesting things I think about King Lear, for instance, Shakespeare's King Lear, is that was not after 1680, roughly 1680, his version wasn't on the stage anymore. It was rewritten by a guy called Nahum Tate. And that was the version of King Lear that was on the stage for 150 years. And in that version, you have a happy ending. You don't have Lear come in cradling his daughter who's been hanged, because they couldn't cope with that. They couldn't cope. And it's not just because I think King Lear, of all his plays, really represents this complete barren. I mean, it is barren. It's pre-Christian. It is godless. It's this society where exactly what you describe, the best type of person has the worst possible experience. In spite of what critics have said, Lear is meant to be much loved, a great ruler who is subjected to this endless cruelty that ultimately ends in an unbearable moment. The unbearable moment is Cordelia coming in dead. His fool has been hanged. It is complete nihilism. This is a play that makes you think, what if there was nothing else? What if there was no God? What if being good didn't matter? What if the very worst things happened to the best? And they couldn't handle it. So the Nahum Tate version was what people went to see. And in the end, Cordelia gets married to Edgar, and it's a happy ending. And although that seems like a travesty to us, it actually makes sense to me as well. It makes sense why audience goers didn't want to confront that. Why would they?
Well, because I don't think they would, but I think the horrible truth might be that the only way to paradise is through death and hell.
Right.
And that's like, I'm not saying that with any degree of satisfaction, but I don't see because look, one of the things I tried to do, I took my studies of Auschwitz in particular, but also the Gulag really seriously. You know, I was trying to figure out, well, I tried to put myself in the position of an Auschwitz camp guard who kind of enjoyed his job. Right, and the horrible thing is you can put yourself in that position. And the horrible thing about that is you discover all sorts of things about yourself by thereby doing so that you pretty much wish you never discovered. But the upside, and I suppose this is the redemptive upside, is that if you recognize within yourself the source of all malevolence and evil, if you can actually do that, if you'll look at that, then you can transcend it. But there's no other way. There's no pretense. And I've been terrified of this for decades. It's what I taught my students at Harvard and at the University of Toronto. I said, you have to take upon yourself the sins of the perpetrator in order to rectify the catastrophe of the Holocaust. And weirdly and perversely, the leftist radicals in some demented way are insisting upon that, right? They say, well, the problem is they put the onus on the souls of other people. They say, well, look, you powerful people, you white people, you privileged group people, you're the perpetrators. It's like, no, God damn it, you're the perpetrator.
Yeah, but it's really hard, though, for them to put themselves in that position and for them to confront that aspect of their own soul, if we want to call it that, because...
Yeah, it's the hardest thing. It's the hardest thing.
But also they can't do it because they don't recognize their own behavior for what it is. They don't see that they are the cruelest of the cruel. They don't see that they are themselves capable of all sorts of monstrosities, because I've seen the way they behave.
It also might be, Andrew, that they don't see anything. Like, something has to... Okay, I always believed that if you understood something, you could find your way forward. Like, I would say that's... And I think my father helped me with that in some deep way, right? He instilled that in me in some way I don't really understand. And I've always been convinced of that. And so one of the consequences of that is the idea that, well, if you can take it upon yourself to gaze into the abyss, let's say as deep as you possibly can, that what you will see eventually, if you look hard enough, is the light. But you have to believe that the light is a possibility, right? And maybe that's the fundamental axiom of an appropriate faith, is the light is a possibility. And if all you believe is that power rules, well, how can you look upon evil without despair?
And what are the consequences for humanity if you have a ruling ideology that doesn't enable any of us to have that experience anymore? Because that seems to me to be
the what the consequence is. We saw it through the 20th century.
Right.
Right? Many times.
Well, I suppose then it's not too alarmist to say that that's where the woke are leading us. Certainly in a spiritual
That's what
level.
It looks like to me. Well, no comedy, no art, no literature, right? No science, no free speech, no redemption from guilt.
Yes.
No genuine individual identity, no up, no down, right? Just a desert of barren endeavor. Right?
Yes.
With maybe some impulsive hedonism thrown in now and then.
Yet they would deny everything you've just said. They would deny every claim that you're making there. They would say they're not trying to do any of that at all. That they want to preserve art. They want free speech to flourish. They just want to protect marginalized communities within that. That would be their argument. So it's very difficult to combat.
The marginalized community argument is a very interesting one too. I've been trying to work that through, especially with Pajot. And he helped me walk through the idea of the center and the fringe in the biblical corpus. And so there's an idea, for example, in the ancient geography of the ancient Israelite times, the poor were allowed to glean on the edges of the fields. Right? So there was a border of uncertainty around, what would you say, around a demarcated territory. And that border of uncertainty was where the marginalized were allowed to thrive. And so there does have to be a center and there has to be a margin. But if you bring the margin to the center, you destroy the center and you destroy the margin. And that's partly why I don't buy the postmodern claim that it's compassion that's driving the centering of the marginalized, because that's a serpent that eats its own tail. And I think what we're seeing happen right now on the LGBT front is that the fringe of the fringe is devouring the fringe faster than the center even, right? Because you know that most of the kids who are surgically transitioned would have been gay. It's 80%.
Yeah.
Right. So that's pretty damn interesting. And So
that might be the thing that breaks it apart. I wonder if that's the thing that breaks it apart, because there is now a schism within this LGBTQIA2S plus, whatever you want to call it, community, which doesn't exist anyway. And the schism is precisely what you described, which is that gender identity ideology is not just a fanciful theory, a quasi-religious way of viewing the world. It's also actively anti-gay, insofar as it does suggest, well, firstly, it denies homosexuality, because homosexuality and gay rights have always been predicated on the recognition that a minority of people are attracted to members of their own sex. It eliminates that by saying there's no such thing as same-sex attraction, and that actually you should be attracted to gender or gender identity. This is why Stonewall, which is the UK's foremost LGBT charity, redefined the word homosexual on their website to say it's same gender attracted. I wrote an article recently about this, and I mentioned Nancy Kelly.
Non-women being attracted to other non-women.
Right. Oh,
no,
my
non-men.
goodness.
Non-men being attracted to other non-men.
Exactly.
That was great, man.
That's the definition of lesbian now, is non-men are attracted to non-men. It's unbelievable. And Nancy Kelly, who the CEO of Stonewall, has said that women who want to exclude biological men from their dating pool are sexual racists, or akin to sexual racists.
Yeah. Well, that's the logical.
Right.
I said this 5 years ago in a discussion I had at Queen's University. It's like, well, you don't think discrimination is right? No, we don't. Well, how about sexual discrimination? Should you just lay down on the ground and spread your legs for every comer, so to speak?
Yeah.
Because you're certainly being discriminatory if you don't. Like, really, like fundamentally, that is the most egregious form of discrimination. They're right about that.
Absolutely. A sexual orientation is a form of discrimination. Like she says you're like a sexual racist if you don't want to sleep with someone with a penis and you're a woman. No, you're just homosexual. Right. That's what she's describing homosexuality there. But she's saying that homosexuality is itself bigoted. And that's coming from the head of the foremost gay rights charity in this country. That's insane. The inversions are incredible. You know, when I was at school, the kids who were effeminate, the boys who were effeminate, who didn't want to play football and all the rest of it, the bullies called them girls. They said, you're just girls. You're not even a proper boy. You're not a real boy. That's what Mermaids and Stonewall says now. They say that's what the Tavistock was doing. They're saying you're basically probably trapped in the wrong body. Let's fix you. Like you say, between 80 and 90% of adolescents referred to the Tavistock Clinic are same-sex attracted.
Well, that's what they do in Tehran. That's the head of gender transformation, sex transformation surgery in the world.
The mullahs
which
in
is
Tehran,
really quite something.
The mullahs in Tehran and the heads of Stonewall are peas in a pod. They're totally, they feel the same way about homosexuality. Iran and Pakistan for a while, although not anymore, were funding same-sex change operations because they hang gay people from cranes. That's why. They get you get the death penalty for being gay. So of course they want to heterosexualize and fix gay people. But I would never have seen this coming. None of us did. You know, I've spoken to all these gay activists who've come out of retirement basically, and they're like, we never saw it coming. Where, you know, it's more dangerous now to be a gay kid than it was when I was growing up. Far more dangerous. When I was growing up.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
So you guys were actually doing pretty good under the. What would you say?
We were doing all right.
Thumb of the Judeo-Christian fascists.
I mean,
instead of the tender mercies of the tea activist types.
You know, we had the government implementing a thing called Section 28, where they said that teachers couldn't mention homosexuality in schools unless they linked it to AIDS. That's not great. That's a terrible situation to be in. So there was that. So we had anti-gay ideas from members of staff. Fine. If you were out as a gay kid, which no one was, by the way, you would be beaten up. You would be bullied. You would be abused, right? But what you wouldn't have is the figures in authority wanting to chop your dick off. You would, and that's so it's much more dangerous now. Like you wouldn't have politicians and the media and the commentariat and gay charities saying, maybe we need to fix you. Maybe we need to sterilize you, medicalize
so let me ask you a question about that. And this is one that's really, well, I don't know what to make of it. You know, just like the stereotypical guy who says he's not bigoted, I have a lot of gay friends, and they're people I really admire. So Bjorn Lomborg, Douglas Murray, you, like Andy No, you know, that's four. Those are pretty stellar examples, by the way. I have a sneaking suspicion, by the way, that the genetic configuration that leads to male homosexuality is integrally tied up with creativity itself, and that's why it sustains itself in the gene pool.
That is fascinating. If true, put it aside, but Because I've always wondered why you have this disproportionate correlation
that's
of
the best,
homosexuality and art.
Another possibility too, which is that if you happen to get the balance between masculine and feminine qualities exactly right as a man, you are hyper attractive to women.
Right.
So that's another possibility, right? So you could think of homosexuality as an overshoot of that target. Now, I'm speculating, although I think the creativity hypothesis is a better one. Imagine that homosexuality is polygenetic, but it's associated with a much higher probability of creativity. Well, then obviously it's going to be conserved, even though it has, lack of reproductive ability. As it has to be associated with something stellar, because obviously it would just disappear. So, and gay men are radically overrepresented in creative disciplines, like radically.
If you can get to the heart of why that is, I'd be absolutely fascinated by that. But that was a side point, wasn't it? That was a side point from what you wanted to say about.
Well, here is what I wanted to ask you about, and I don't know what to do about this. It's like, I think that part of the problem that we're trying to figure out is back 20 years ago, we did what we could to bring, especially male homosexuality, into the center, right? By legalizing gay marriage and by attempting to normalize it in some ways. Now, I think that left a lot of questions unanswered. So here's one question. It's like, well, okay, now if it's normalized all of a sudden, same-sex relationships, same-sex sexual relationships, where do you draw the line and what the hell do you teach children? And one answer would be, you don't talk about sex at all. And another answer would be, well, you talk about gay sex 50% of the time. I don't know what the answer is, but it really is a problem. And I think we're dashing ourselves to pieces in some ways trying to solve that problem. And I don't know what the hell the solution in the US is take your kids out of the school system. That's what the solution seems to be. So, but I don't know what you think about all that.
It's so difficult because I think educationists at the moment are getting it very, very wrong in terms of what they're teaching children about sex and gender and sexuality and all the rest of it. And I think gay people are bearing the brunt of a lot of the blame here, so I think what's happening is, when you have drag queens twerking in front of children or stripping in front of children.
Yeah, that doesn't seem good.
Doesn't look good. And because they have bracketed us all as LGBTQIA+, this is one big thing, then, and there's evidence, isn't there, that homophobia, or at least, I don't really like the word, but anti-gay sentiment is on the rise, because I think they think this is gay people doing all of this stuff. It's not, it's gender ideologues. It's gender ideologues who have taken over the LGBT community, whatever that might be. And as I've said, gender ideology is actively hostile to homosexuality. So gay people aren't the agents of these societal changes. They're the victims of it. Because now I'm getting it from both sides. So I published that article in the Mail on about the pride flag, and I was getting gender ideologues piling in on me, calling me evil and telling me I should kill myself, and the lovely things that the compassionate people often say. And then I was also getting right-wing people, mostly from America, calling me a sodomite and saying that I was evil and that I was going to burn in hell for my sexual orientation. So now we've got it from both sides. So great. Thanks for that. That's what the woke have done. It's not, and that's why.
Yeah, and that isn't over yet. That isn't over yet. That's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. And God only knows how it's going to shake out. I mean, this year's Pride celebration was a whole new
people are getting sick of it.
Yes.
They really
well,
are.
and no bloody wonder. A month? Really?
Yeah. But
Good
also
God, guys.
Partly because it's become so corporate. It's a sign, corporations put their flags up they don't put it up in the Middle East or in Saudi Arabia or places like that where it might actually make a difference, by the way, flying that flag where gay people are killed for being gay. No, they don't do that, but they put it up here. They never did this, by the way, before gay marriage, before the age of consent was equalized. They didn't do any of that. They're doing it now because corporations are so in lockstep with the woke ideology, which is another reason, by the way, if you want to go back to this left-right distinction, why I think this is so unhelpful, because it's a movement.
Right. I agree. And I don't think there's any worse woke than woke capitalism.
No.
That's the bastard child of greed and ideology, man. It's some sort of monster.
Well, that is right-wing wokeness. It can't be anything but, because capitalism is, these are essentially money-making bodies. These are not socialist organizations. So there is a confusion there. And also, by the way, whenever the woke always side against the workers, whenever
I know that's so and the poor.
and
It's
the
so
poor.
like, and I know that's so interesting too, because I've watched the radicals, especially in Europe, over the last 5 years, because I was curious. It's like, well, when push comes to shove, let's say on the climate front, are they going to sacrifice the poor on the altar of woke? And the answer is, in a bloody heartbeat, in a second,
That's
no
what net
holds
zero
barred.
does. Net
You
zero
bet,
does
you
precisely
bet.
that. It's the poor that bear the brunt. But that's why I don't think
Absolutely.
well, and whereas I'm probably wrong to say the wokeness is closer to the right or whatever that is, it's definitely not a left-wing movement in any traditional understanding of what left-wing means. It can't be.
No, I think we have to stop thinking about it politically altogether.
Exactly,
I think
exactly.
fundamentally the religious analysis is the right one. But that's a weird one, Andrew. That's going to take us some strange places, because if this is actually, first of all, we're actually making the claim that this is a spiritual battle, right? A religious battle. And that's a hell of a claim to make, especially for somebody who's more tilted towards atheism. And I don't even know what the hell it means to make that claim. But I don't think it is a political struggle fundamentally.
That's right. And then, and to bring that into the LGBTQ stuff, the way that sex education appears to be run at the moment, and I don't know how it is necessarily where you are, but in Wales, definitely, in Scotland, definitely, and in England, we are having similar problems. You have gender ideologues writing the curriculum effectively.
Yeah.
So children are being told.
Even worse,
it is
Canada after all.
Oh yeah, of course.
Think of this country. I mean, we've got narcissistic. We've got what would we say? We've got the cardinal narcissist running our country. He's everything woke you could possibly imagine, and he's got that psychopathic charm that lends itself to fooling gullible women. It's a perfect bloody storm.
So I don't see any difference between effectively encouraging teachers to promote gender identity ideology to young children as having some kind of hook-handed Islamic cleric come in and say gay people should be burned to death. I don't really see the difference there insofar as you're promoting a really reactionary belief system onto children when it comes to the realm of sex and sexuality. And I think that's really, really dangerous. So unless we grapple with this point, or unless we as a general population grapple with the fact that sex education now is really a religious preaching, that's all it is. You were talking about, where do you stop? How much do you teach them about what? Actually, kids generally learn and figure things out for themselves, don't they? So I've always been of the view that sex education doesn't need to be I think people need to know the basics, but I think there's far too much of it going on. But we've reached the point where, I mean, you must have heard this audio recording that was leaked this week from a school in England, a place called Rye College. The teacher was recorded berating two 13-year-old girls because they would not accept that one of their peers identified as a cat.
Yeah.
And look, it looks
well, it
silly.
is pretty rude,
It is.
To not let the poor girl wear a tail and all of that.
Well, this is the thing. There was a report in the Telegraph this week as well saying that there's a school where one child identifies as a horse. There's one who identifies as a dinosaur. There's one who quite creatively identifies as a moon and wears a cape. Now, I think what's happening there is those kids are being satirical. What they're seeing is...
God, I hope so.
No, I think they are.
Go kids, go.
The kids that are saying, I'm a cat and I need to lie down and I need to be stroked and I need to meow. Look, they have seen that the figures of authority, the teachers, are totally capitulating to this bizarre belief system, this esoteric cult. And unless
I would have done that in a heartbeat when I was 13.
I would have. As a kid,
Absolutely,
I would 100%. I would have said, I'm a velociraptor, and you have to, and you do what I say or I'll eat you or whatever. I don't care what it is, but these kids are pushing. They always test the limits anyway. But what's brilliant about this is the teachers can't do anything about it. If a young child decides he's a moon and wears a cape and a teacher says, no, you're not, she's denying the sacred creed of gender identity ideology, which is in the national curriculum now. So she'll get fired. So this puts the kids in an incredible position of power. They're having fun with it. And this is also why I'm slightly heartened by this, because I kind of think the kids are going to be our way out of this. I hope that this mad religious fervor will burn out because the kids see it for what it is. The fact that woman in that recording was saying that these girls were, I think she said they were despicable. I think that was the word she used, despicable, for not validating or accepting their friend's identity as a cat. That's such an extreme position for a teacher to take. I also don't think it's fair to dogpile her and bombard. And I saw some someone doxing her, putting her face. And look, she's just following. She's probably not a very intelligent person. She's probably not a very thinking person. She's just following what she's told to say. She's been told by all of the teacher training colleges, all of the academics in education that this is the case and you've got to go with it. And she's just doing her job. So I think that's unfair as well. I would like teachers to be more intelligent and creative and to challenge this stuff. But, that's not happening. So yeah, maybe.
So I guess we're learning why the eternal serpent always devours its own tail, right?
Right.
It's so
and
interesting
hoping that
to
it
see
does.
these things pushed too far, start to eat themselves. We're living in the strangest times, man.
That might be it. That might be the hope, though, right? It's an optimistic point to make, but ultimately, because I think this ideology is not sustainable, because it is full of.
We did walk ourselves back from the brink of tyranny on the COVID lockdown front, right? I mean, we went full totalitarian for 2 years, but then everybody seemed to decide maybe that wasn't such a good idea.
But that's quite instructive, isn't it? The way that we now talk about it, everyone no one mentions it now, do they? It was, you walk around, very few people wearing masks. People have just there came a weird turning point where everyone just decided, actually, it's a virus with a very low mortality rate. Let's just not worry about it. And that just sort of happened. People have forgotten the mania, the extreme mania, people screaming at each other on the streets if they weren't wearing masks, and the extreme policies, the Canadian government's reaction to the truckers who were worried about their livelihood due to lockdown.
You mean stealing their bank accounts?
Stealing their bank accounts and threatening to give the money to charities or something? You'll know.
Go said so. $10 million was raised on GoFundMe.
That's it. Yeah.
And then the GoFundMe decided they weren't going to distribute it to the truckers. Then they decided, instead of refunding it, they were going to distribute it to a charity of their choice. Then Ron DeSantis said, I think you better not do that or else. And then they decided they would refund it. And now the money that hasn't been refunded is in escrow, and there's a huge fight in Canada about who owns it. We haven't settled the trucker mess here at all. But the trucker convoy, it had something to do with everybody taking those goddamn masks off.
I'm sure. I wonder, though, how those politicians who were involved in this will feel about this in 20 years' time. I wonder about that. I know one of your politicians claimed that the truckers were beeping their horns because they were dog whistling to fascists, because the honk honk is HH, and that means Heil Hitler. I mean, that was something that was seriously said.
That's common knowledge here, Andrew. Everybody who honks their horn is actually secretly admiring Hitler, especially if they do it twice.
That is so insane. So I wonder whether if
that's Salem witch trial level of insane.
Exactly, and Salem is a good example, right? Because there's a reason I've used it in the book, is that I think it gives us our clues to our way out. Because Salem happened so quickly. It happened within just over a year, right? Late 17th century, this hysteria emerged from nowhere and fizzled out immediately. And everyone afterwards repented. All of the people who were most involved in it said, we got that wrong. What happened there? We went mad for a while there. Because they weren't
well, this
witch
is
hunters.
The first... This is maybe the first widespread mental illness afflicting our new electronic nervous system.
That's it. I think this is a hysteria on a global scale, akin to what happened in Salem. I think it's perpetuated itself by a similar means, which is firstly just the mechanism of hysteria, which I'm not qualified to talk about, but also the fact that people in authority go along with it because they're terrified not to. Because in Salem, anyone said, hang on, I don't think this is right, they were the next to be executed. So you don't have politicians saying, hang on a minute, is it possible for human beings to change sex? Do I know what a woman is? They all know the answer, just as the magistrates in Salem knew that the girls weren't seeing the devil. But it all fizzled out very, very quickly. One of the points I make in the book is about that all of the prosecutions were secured on this thing called spectral evidence. In other words, the girls' experience, what we call lived experience. The girls believed that they were seeing devils, and therefore that was taken as evidence. And that's why the cases collapsed, because at the end, the deputy governor of Massachusetts wrote to the leading clergymen in the country and said, can spectral evidence be admissible in court? And they all said, no, of course not. The whole thing disappeared overnight. Everyone denied they had any part in it. These weren't witch hunters. They didn't go around hunting witches. That happened a lot in Europe. It didn't happen in New England. And so they
maybe
were good
that's the
people.
least stupid pathway forward for us now. And maybe, God willing, that's the one we'll take. We should stop, I guess. I don't want to, because you're very entertaining to talk to. For everybody watching and listening, I'm going to talk to Andrew for another half an hour on the Daily Wire Plus platform side, a little bit more personally. I want to see a bit more about what makes him tick. And so if you're interested in that, head over to the Daily Wire Plus platform. You could throw those characters, those reprehensible right-wing bastards, a penny or two if you're inclined to, because, you know, they are heading the fight to support free speech in the US. You know, YouTube has been after us, because I'm allied with the Daily Wire types, been after us pretty badly in the last month. They took down 3 of my talks, including one with Helen Joyce, because you know how reprehensible good old Helen, the Economist journalist, is. And they also took down a talk I had with Robert F. Kennedy, despite the fact that he's running for president. And so that's YouTube, and they're definitely going after all the Daily Wire folks. So thank you all for your time and attention, and to Andrew for talking to me and helping me delve into these things, get a little bit more clarity along with everyone else. And for everyone watching and listening, we'll see you soon. And to the Daily Wire folks, thanks for your support. Andrew, off to the Daily Wire.
Thank you very much.